Laughter echoed through the mahogany-panelled courtroom, sharp and unforgiving. Theodore Prescott leaned back in his leather chair, a triumphant smirk plastered across his perfectly stubbled face, while his new fiancée giggled behind a designer handbag. They thought they had backed his quiet, unassuming ex-wife into a corner, leaving her with pennies after a brutal 5-year marriage. They painted her as a lazy parasite, a footnote in his brilliant success story. But arrogance breeds profound blindness. What Theodore and his high-priced legal team failed to realize was that the woman sitting silently across the aisle wasn't a helpless victim. She was the apex predator. The air inside courtroom 302 of the Manhattan Family Court was thick with an unsettling blend of expensive cologne and palpable malice. Dust motes danced in the harsh beams of morning sunlight that sliced through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the sharp divide between the two tables. At the petitioner's table sat Theodore Prescott, clad in a custom 3-piece Tom Ford suit that screamed new money. Theo looked less like a man navigating the dissolution of a marriage, and more like a CEO about to close a hostile takeover. He possessed the kind of rugged, manufactured, handsome features that graced the covers of local business magazines that frequently lauded him as New York's rising star in luxury real estate development. Next to him sat Simon Fletcher, a notoriously aggressive divorce attorney known for his theatrical, often brutal, courtroom tactics. Directly behind Theo, occupying the front row of the gallery, was his personal cheering section. There was his mother, Beatrice Prescott, her neck weighed down by pearls, casting disdainful glares across the aisle. Beside her sat Chloe Sinclair, Theo's 24-year-old fiancée. Chloe was a former social media influencer turned interior design consultant, a title Theo had bought for her. She was busy checking her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, occasionally pausing to shoot a haughty, pitying look at the woman she was replacing. And then there was Madeline Hayes. Sitting completely still at the respondent's table, Madeline presented a stark contrast to the circus across the room. She wore a simple, unbranded beige-tailored suit. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat, unassuming chignon, and her face was stripped of makeup, save for a hint of lip balm. To the casual observer, she looked defeated, a woman entirely out of her depth. To Theo, she looked exactly as she always had, ordinary, unimaginative, and entirely dependent on his brilliance. Judge Harrison Davies, a silver-haired jurist with a reputation for zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, adjusted his glasses and peered over a mountain of manila folders. "All right, counsel. Let's proceed with opening statements regarding the equitable distribution of assets. Mr. Fletcher, you may begin." Simon Fletcher stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a flourish. He paced toward the center of the floor, commanding the room's attention. "Your Honor," Fletcher began, his voice dripping with practiced gravitas. "We are here today to finalize the dissolution of a marriage that has, for all intents and purposes, been entirely one-sided. My client, Theodore Prescott, is the sole driving force behind Prescott Developments, a firm currently valued at over $15 million. He is a self-made man who has poured his blood, sweat, and tears into building an empire." Fletcher paused, turning slowly to gesture dismissively toward Madeline. "And what, Your Honor, was the respondent's contribution to this empire?" Over the course of their 5-year marriage, Ms. Hayes engaged in what can generously be described as light freelance bookkeeping. She operated a vaguely defined consulting shell, Zenith Consulting, from the comfort of their couch. She contributed no capital. She brought in no clients. Her annual reported income barely scratched $30,000. She was perfectly content to ride the coattails of my client's relentless ambition. A quiet snicker erupted from the gallery. Chloe covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. Theo reached back, gently squeezing Chloe's hand, his eyes locked on Madeline with a mixture of triumph and absolute contempt. "Therefore," Fletcher continued, his tone turning sharp, we respectfully submit that the respondent is entitled to nothing beyond the premarital assets she brought into this union, namely, a 2018 Honda Accord and her personal savings. My client will retain full ownership of the Park Avenue penthouse, the vehicles, and 100% equity in Prescott Developments. To grant her anything more would not be an equitable distribution. It would be a state-sanctioned robbery. Fletcher returned to his seat, looking thoroughly pleased with himself. Theo patted his lawyer on the back. It was a masterclass in character assassination, designed to humiliate Madeline into taking a pitiful settlement just to make the ordeal stop. Judge Davies turned his weary gaze to the respondent's table. Mr. Caldwell, are you prepared to offer an opening statement? Benjamin Caldwell, Madeline's attorney, was a man in his late 60s. He didn't have Fletcher's flashy suits or dramatic pacing. He simply stood up, his demeanor entirely unbothered. Your Honor, Caldwell said softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. We have no opening statement at this time. We are perfectly content to let the financial records speak for themselves. We only ask that the court examine the entire scope of the marital estate and the entities that fund it very, very closely. Theo scoffed audibly. What entities? Her knitting club? He muttered to Fletcher, loud enough for the first row to hear. More chuckles rippled through the gallery. Madeline didn't flinch. She simply picked up her pen, made a small note on her legal pad, and waited. The trap had been set years ago. Today, the jaws were finally going to snap shut. The morning dragged on as the court waded through the tedious waters of financial discovery. Simon Fletcher was relentless, treating the proceedings less like a legal inquiry and more like a public roasting. His strategy was clear: parade Madeline's apparent poverty before the court to prove she had no financial acumen, thereby solidifying Theo's claim as the sole breadwinner. Let us turn our attention to Exhibit D, Fletcher announced loudly, waving a bank statement in the air. This is the primary checking account for Ms. Hayes. Your Honor, the balance as of the date of filing was exactly $4,250.72. He turned toward Madeline, his eyes gleaming with malice. Ms. Hayes, can you confirm this is your primary, personal checking account? Madeline looked up calmly. Yes, Mr. Fletcher. That is one of my accounts. One of them? Fletcher laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Are we to believe you have millions stashed away in an offshore haven, Ms. Hayes? Because according to your tax returns, your little business, Zenith Consulting, operated at a net loss for the first 3 years of your marriage. Is that correct? Zenith Consulting is a holding and management entity, Madeline replied, her voice steady and perfectly modulated. Its primary function early on was not generating immediate liquid profit. Of course not, Fletcher sneered. Its primary function was giving you an excuse to stay home while my client worked 18-hour days. Your Honor, my client's firm, Prescott Developments, cleared over $4 million in pure profit last year alone. He has just secured a massive partnership with a private equity firm that guarantees his company's expansion into commercial high-rises. He is a titan of his industry. To suggest that a woman who cannot maintain a personal bank balance of $5,000 is entitled to half of his multi-million-dollar empire is offensive to the very concept of justice. In the gallery, Beatrice Prescott leaned over to Chloe. Finally, the gold digger gets put in her place, she whispered, her voice carrying through the quiet room. Theo leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. He felt invincible. He had planned this divorce for months, carefully transferring liquid cash into the business, inflating his corporate expenses, and securing his new private equity deal to ensure his net worth looked tied up and inaccessible to his wife. He had outsmarted her. He was a genius. Nothing further for this witness, Your Honor, Fletcher declared proudly. Judge Davies nodded. Mr. Caldwell, your witness. Benjamin Caldwell slowly rose to his feet. He walked to the center of the room, adjusting his reading glasses. I have no questions for my client at this time, Your Honor. However, I would like to call Mr. Theodore Prescott to the stand. Theo practically leapt out of his chair, eager to regale the court with the tale of his own brilliance. He took the oath with a smug smile and settled into the witness box, shooting a wink at Chloe. Mr. Prescott, Caldwell began, his tone almost conversational. You have painted a very impressive picture of your business acumen today. You are the sole founder and CEO of Prescott Developments, correct? That is correct, Theo said proudly. And you consider yourself highly successful. The numbers speak for themselves, Mr. Caldwell. I took out a small business loan 5 years ago, and I turned it into a powerhouse. I hustle. I don't sit around waiting for handouts. He shot a pointed look at Madeline. Commendable, Caldwell noted, shuffling his papers. Now, you recently restructured your company's debt, did you not? Your attorney mentioned a massive partnership. Theo puffed out his chest. Yes, real estate is capital intensive. I recently secured a strategic buyout of my debt and a fresh injection of capital from a top-tier private equity fund, Obsidian Vanguard. They recognized my potential. They bought out the mortgages on my 3 largest development sites and gave me full operational control to build my vision. Obsidian Vanguard, Caldwell repeated the name slowly, tasting the syllables. A very prestigious firm. Based in London, if I recall. They have offices globally, Theo corrected, relishing the chance to sound sophisticated. They don't just invest in anyone. They require a rigorous audit. They invest in winners. I see, Caldwell said. He walked back to his table and picked up a remarkably thick, heavily sealed binder. And as part of this deal with Obsidian Vanguard, you signed over the collateral deeds to your properties in exchange for the capital injection and a salary, while retaining an equity stake. Is that an accurate summary? Fletcher stood up. Objection, Your Honor. The specifics of my client's corporate contracts are proprietary and irrelevant to the equitable distribution of his personal marital assets. On the contrary, Your Honor, Caldwell countered smoothly. The structure of this deal is the very crux of the marital estate. Mr. Prescott claims he owns Prescott Developments. We simply wish to verify who actually owns Mr. Prescott. Judge Davies narrowed his eyes, intrigued. Overruled. You may answer the question, Mr. Prescott. Theo scowled, his confidence dipping slightly, though his arrogance remained firmly intact. Yes. Obsidian Vanguard holds the debt collateral. It's standard business practice. It doesn't mean I don't own my company. Of course not, Caldwell said softly. He approached the witness stand and handed Theo a document. Mr. Prescott, please look at the signature page of the master investment agreement you signed with Obsidian Vanguard 6 months ago. Theo snatched the paper, rolling his eyes. I've seen it 100 times. Could you read the name of the authorized signatory for Obsidian Vanguard? Theo sighed loudly, bringing the paper closer. It's signed by the regional director, J. Vance. Wait. No. He squinted. The countersignature for the parent holding company is M. Hayes. Theo froze. His eyes darted from the paper to Madeline, who was looking back at him with a gaze as placid and unreadable as a deep lake. A ripple of nervous energy swept through the courtroom. In the gallery, Chloe stopped looking at her phone. M. Hayes, Theo repeated, his voice suddenly lacking its earlier boom. He forced a laugh. It's a common name. What is this? A joke? Let's explore that, Caldwell said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute precision. Let's talk about jokes, Mr. Prescott. Your Honor, Caldwell said, turning his back on Theo and addressing the judge directly. My client, Madeline Hayes, did indeed run a company called Zenith Consulting from the couch of her shared apartment. Mr. Fletcher was entirely correct about that. Caldwell pulled another document from the heavy binder and handed a copy to the judge, and another to a suddenly pale Simon Fletcher. What Mr. Fletcher failed to uncover in his rather sloppy discovery process, Caldwell continued, is that Zenith Consulting is not a freelance bookkeeping service. It is a private wealth management shell established by my client prior to the marriage to manage her personal family trust and her subsequent venture capital investments. Theo gripped the edges of the witness box. Objection? He's lying. Theo barked, forgetting courtroom protocol. Her family doesn't have money. She worked at a coffee shop when I met her. Mr. Prescott, contain yourself, Judge Davies warned, his eyes glued to the document in his hands. She was 22 and learning the value of ground-level labor at a subsidiary her family owned. Mr. Prescott, Caldwell clarified, without missing a beat. Now, returning to the documents. Exhibit F, Your Honor. The corporate registry for Obsidian Vanguard. Fletcher was furiously scanning the pages, his hands beginning to tremble. This is a forgery. Obsidian Vanguard is a multi-billion-dollar European fund. It is indeed, Caldwell nodded. And as you can see on page 4, section 8, tracing the corporate veil, Obsidian Vanguard is a wholly owned subsidiary of Ethelgard Holdings, and Ethelgard Holdings is owned, in its entirety, by Zenith Consulting. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that precedes a massive storm. Theo stared at Caldwell, his mouth slightly open, the gears in his head grinding to a violent halt. No, he whispered. No, that's impossible. I met with the partners. I flew to London. You met with my client's employees, Mr. Prescott, Caldwell corrected gently. Employees who were instructed to evaluate your failing real estate business. You see, Your Honor, contrary to Mr. Prescott's glowing testimony, Prescott Developments was on the verge of bankruptcy 6 months ago. He had over-leveraged his assets, defaulted on 2 major loans, and was facing foreclosure on his properties. Lies, Theo shouted, his face turning an ugly shade of crimson. He looked wildly at his mother, who was sitting frozen, her jaw slack. It is all in the financial disclosures, Your Honor, Caldwell said, ignoring the outburst. My client, Miss Hayes, saw that her husband was about to lose everything. Rather than humiliating him by writing him a personal check, which she knew his fragile ego would never accept, she instructed her investment firm to bail him out. Obsidian Vanguard assumed his debts, restructured his company, and kept him on as a salaried CEO so he could save face. You set me up, Theo roared, pointing a shaking finger at Madeline. You manipulative! You set me up! Mr. Prescott, sit down and be quiet. Judge Davies slammed his gavel, his voice echoing like a gunshot. The judge looked back at the paperwork, his eyebrows raised so high they nearly touched his hairline. He looked at Madeline, who still hadn't changed her expression. She simply sat there, hands neatly folded in her lap. Let me understand this, Mr. Caldwell, the judge said slowly, tracing the flowcharts with his pen. The petitioner, Mr. Prescott, is currently demanding full ownership of his company, Prescott Developments. He is, Your Honor. But according to these signed contracts, he surrendered 90% of the equity in Prescott Developments to Obsidian Vanguard in exchange for debt forgiveness. That is correct, Your Honor, Caldwell smiled, and Obsidian Vanguard is ultimately owned by the respondent, Ms. Hayes. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Davies let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. He looked down at Simon Fletcher, who looked as though he might be physically ill. Mr. Fletcher, it appears your client does not own a $15 million empire. It appears your client is, in fact, an employee of his wife. A loud, strangled gasp escaped from Chloe Sinclair in the gallery. The designer handbag slipped from her lap, hitting the wooden floor with a dull thud. Theo looked like he was suffocating. He tugged at his silk tie, his chest heaving. The penthouse, he stammered desperately, grasping at straws. We still have the penthouse. I bought that. My name is on the mortgage. Benjamin Caldwell offered a smile that lacked any warmth. Ah, yes. The Park Avenue penthouse. I'm glad you brought that up, Mr. Prescott. Let's talk about where you live. The phrase, let's talk about where you live, hung in the cavernous space, of courtroom 302 like a guillotine waiting to drop. Theodore Prescott's smug facade had entirely evaporated, replaced by a sheen of cold sweat that caught the harsh fluorescent lighting above the witness stand. He gripped the wooden railing, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. "The penthouse is mine," Theo repeated, though his voice lacked its previous booming authority. It sounded thin, desperate, like a man trying to convince himself of a reality that was rapidly slipping through his fingers. "I hold the deed. My name is on the mortgage with Manhattan Sovereign Bank. I pay $50,000 a month to maintain that property. You can't touch it." Benjamin Caldwell, Madeline's attorney, adjusted his glasses and offered a slow, almost pitying nod. He turned to the judge, his demeanor as unruffled as a calm sea. "Your Honor, Mr. Prescott is partially correct. His name is indeed on the mortgage documents for the property located at 432 Park Avenue. He purchased the property 2 years ago for an agreed sum of $8 million, putting down a cash deposit of $1.5 million. Simon Fletcher, Theo's attorney, stood up, attempting to salvage some shred of his client's dignity. "There you have it, Your Honor. A clear-cut marital asset, purchased primarily by my client's hard-earned capital. Given Ms. Hayes's hidden financial advantages, we believe my client should retain exclusive rights to his primary residence." "Mr. Fletcher, I strongly advise you to let me finish before you make further demands on behalf of a man who doesn't even own the chair he sits in at work," Caldwell interjected smoothly, a dangerous edge creeping into his polite tone. He reached into his seemingly bottomless briefcase and pulled out another heavily tabbed folder. "Your Honor, I direct your attention to Exhibit G, the capital origination report for Mr. Prescott's $1.5 million down payment." Judge Davies accepted the folder from the bailiff, his eyes scanning the top page. A low whistle escaped the judge's lips. "Mr. Caldwell, am I reading this correctly?" "I believe you are, Your Honor," Caldwell replied. Mr. Prescott did not use his personal savings for the down payment on the Park Avenue penthouse. He authorized a discreet corporate wire transfer from the operational reserve accounts of Prescott Developments. Theo jolted in the witness box. "It was an owner's draw. I am the CEO. I am allowed to take a draw against future profits." "You are allowed to take a draw if you are the sole equity owner, Mr. Prescott," Caldwell corrected, his voice echoing sharply across the room. "But as we established mere minutes ago, you surrendered 90% of Prescott Developments to Obsidian Vanguard 6 months prior to purchasing that penthouse to save yourself from bankruptcy. You took $1.5 million from a company you didn't own. In the financial sector, we do not call that an owner's draw. We call it corporate embezzlement." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Chloe Sinclair, who had just managed to retrieve her dropped designer handbag, let it fall to the floor once again. She stared at Theo, her meticulously contoured face twisting in horror. Beatrice Prescott pressed a trembling hand over her pearl necklace, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "Objection!" Fletcher shouted, though he sounded panicked. "This is a family court proceeding, not a criminal tribunal. The origin of the funds does not negate the fact that the deed is in his name." "I am well aware of the jurisdiction of this court, Mr. Fletcher," Judge Davies growled, glaring down from the bench. "But I will not divide assets procured through potentially fraudulent corporate transfers. Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Caldwell." "Thank you, Your Honor," Caldwell said, turning his attention back to the sweating man in the witness box. "Mr. Prescott, let us move past the illegal down payment and discuss the mortgage itself. You stated your mortgage is held by Manhattan Sovereign Bank." "Yes," Theo spat out, glaring at Madeline, who was calmly observing a speck of dust on her beige sleeve. "A legitimate, global financial institution, not one of her fake shell companies." "Manhattan Sovereign Bank is indeed legitimate," Caldwell agreed, pacing slowly in front of the respondent's table. "However, high-risk, high-value mortgages, like an $8 million loan given to a man whose company was recently bailed out, are rarely held by the issuing bank. They are bundled and sold to private equity trusts on the secondary market to mitigate risk. Theo's eyes widened, a horrifying realization dawning on him. No. Yes, Mr. Prescott, Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. 1 month after you closed on the penthouse, Manhattan Sovereign Bank sold your mortgage to a private holding firm called the Whitmore Endowment. Care to guess who acts as the sole trustee and primary beneficiary of the Whitmore Endowment? Caldwell didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the judge. Exhibit H, Your Honor. The incorporation documents for the Whitmore Endowment. It is managed exclusively by Zenith Consulting, which means, Your Honor, my client, Madeleine Hayes, is the sole proprietor of her husband's mortgage. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, heavy with the weight of absolute, undeniable defeat. To summarize, Caldwell continued, savoring every syllable. Mr. Prescott used my client's corporate funds to illegally purchase a penthouse and now pays $50,000 a month in mortgage payments directly into a trust fund owned by my client. He is quite literally renting his lifestyle from his wife while pretending to be a self-made titan. You, Theo choked out, pointing a trembling finger at Madeleine. You vicious, calculating. You let me strut around. You let me think I was winning. You smiled at me every night at dinner while you held the leash. You built the leash yourself, Theodore. Madeleine spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, melodic, but it carried the chilling permanence of a steel blade. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The entire room strained to hear her. I simply refused to hand you the scissors. In the gallery, the illusion completely shattered. Chloe Sinclair stood up, her face flushed with fury and embarrassment. You're broke, she shrieked, ignoring the bailiff's immediate warning look. You told me you were buying me a villa in Tuscany next month. You told me she was a penniless loser. Chloe, please, sit down, I can fix this, Theo pleaded from the stand, his polished image entirely destroyed. He looked like a cornered rat in a bespoke suit. Fix it? You're a fraud, Theo, Chloe yelled, grabbing her coat. I'm not spending the best years of my life with a man who is secretly an employee of his ex-wife. With the clatter of expensive heels, Chloe stormed out of the courtroom, leaving the heavy wooden doors swinging in her wake. Beatrice Prescott burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. The golden boy of the Prescott family had just been publicly, thoroughly, and legally dismantled. Simon Fletcher was a shark, but even sharks know when there is blood in the water. And right now, he was bleeding out alongside his client. He ran a hand over his receding hairline, frantically flipping through his legal pad, searching for any possible lifeline. Your Honor, Fletcher began, his voice lacking all of its previous theatrical bravado. He sounded tired, defeated. If the court accepts these documents as valid, which we will naturally need to verify independently, it appears there is a significant disparity in wealth between the two parties. Judge Davies raised a single, cynical eyebrow. That is the understatement of the century, Mr. Fletcher. Where are you going with this? Fletcher cleared his throat, avoiding eye contact with Theo. Given the staggering hidden wealth of the respondent, Miss Hayes, we would like to formally pivot our requests. If my client is to leave this marriage without his company or his primary residence, we argue that he is entitled to substantial spousal support. For 5 years, he was led to believe he was the primary breadwinner, taking on massive stress. Miss Hayes has the means to ensure he maintains the standard of living he has become accustomed to. A dry, echoing laugh escaped from Benjamin Caldwell. He didn't just chuckle, he laughed from his chest, shaking his head. Mr. Fletcher, you are truly a marvel of audacity. You spent the first hour of this trial calling my client a parasite, and now you are begging her for an allowance? It is a standard legal precedent in high-net-worth divorces, Fletcher snapped, his face reddening. It is, Caldwell agreed, stepping back to his table, except for one minor detail. A detail that your client, in his infinite wisdom, insisted upon before he would even walk down the aisle. Caldwell pulled a single, slim document from his briefcase. It wasn't in a binder. It was protected in a clear plastic sleeve. He held it up to the light. "Your Honor, I present Exhibit 1. The prenuptial agreement, drafted entirely by Mr. Prescott's previous legal counsel, signed and notarized 3 weeks before their wedding." Theo sank lower in his chair, putting his head in his hands. He remembered the document. He remembered demanding it. At the time, his real estate business was just getting off the ground, and he was terrified that his quiet, unambitious fiancée would try to steal half of his future millions if things went south. "Let me read Section 4, Paragraph B, for the benefit of the court," Caldwell said, adjusting his glasses. "In the event of a dissolution of marriage, both parties explicitly waive any and all rights to spousal support, alimony, or maintenance, regardless of any disparity in income or accrued wealth during the marriage. What is his remains his. What is hers remains hers." Caldwell looked up, a triumphant gleam in his eye. Mr. Prescott was very adamant about this clause. He wanted to protect his empire from a woman he deemed financially illiterate. He locked himself into an ironclad agreement that prevents him from touching a single cent of her money. Judge Davies read over the copy provided to the bench, nodding slowly. "It appears airtight, Mr. Fletcher. Your client drafted this himself. He made his bed." "There is more, Your Honor," Caldwell interrupted, his tone turning deadly serious. "Mr. Prescott didn't just want to protect his money. He wanted to control his wife's behavior. Section 6 of the same prenuptial agreement outlines an infidelity clause. It states, unequivocally, that if either party is proven to have engaged in an extramarital affair, they immediately forfeit their rights to any joint bank accounts and assume 100% liability for any joint debts accrued during the marriage." Fletcher jumped up. "There is no proof of infidelity. My client's relationship with Ms. Sinclair began after the separation." "Mr. Fletcher, please," Caldwell sighed, waving a hand dismissively. "We are long past the point of insulting this court's intelligence." He handed a thumb drive to the bailiff. "Exhibit J, Your Honor. A compilation of date-stamped photographs, hotel receipts, and private text messages spanning the last 2 years. Furthermore, we have bank statements showing Mr. Prescott used the joint checking account, the one Ms. Hayes occasionally deposited her freelance money into, to purchase a $60,000 diamond engagement ring for Ms. Sinclair 3 months before he even filed for divorce." The judge slammed his hand down on the desk, his patience entirely exhausted. "Mr. Prescott, is this true?" Theo didn't answer. He couldn't. He stared blankly at the mahogany grain of the witness stand, his world having violently collapsed inward. He was bankrupt. He was homeless. He was legally barred from asking for a dime. And because of the infidelity clause he himself had demanded, he was now solely responsible for the massive, outstanding debts he had accrued on their joint credit cards he had maxed out to fund his secret vacations with Chloe. "It seems we have a clear picture of the marital estate," Judge Davies said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But before we conclude, there is one question that remains, Mr. Caldwell. We have established that Miss Hayes owns a massive corporate portfolio through Zenith Consulting. For the official court record, and for the final calculation of the separation of unmingled assets, what is the actual origin of the respondent's wealth? Who exactly is Madeleine Hayes?" Caldwell smiled, turning to look at his client with a look of profound respect. "Your Honor, Madeleine Hayes is legally Madeleine Hayes Garrison. She is the eldest granddaughter of the late Silas Garrison, founder of Garrison Global Logistics." A shocked murmur swept through the courtroom, even catching the stenographer off guard. Garrison Global Logistics was one of the largest shipping and freight conglomerates in the world. Their ships controlled major trade routes. Their warehouses dotted every major continent. "Upon her grandfather's passing," Caldwell explained, Ms. Hayes inherited a controlling 40% stake in the Garrison family trust. While she prefers to live quietly and manage her investments privately through Zenith Consulting, her verified net worth, independent of her family's liquid assets, is currently estimated at $4.2 billion. Theo's head snapped up. "Billion," he whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "You're a billionaire?" Madeline finally stood up. She didn't look angry or triumphant or vindictive. She looked remarkably peaceful. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, her simple beige suit suddenly looking more commanding than any designer gown. "I loved you, Theo," Madeline said, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the silence of the courtroom. "When we met, I was exhausted by people who only saw me as a walking bank vault. I wanted someone who loved me for me. So, I hid my name. I hid my trust. I gave you the space to be the man you claimed you wanted to be." She paused, looking down at him, her eyes filled with a cold, tragic finality. "But you didn't just want to be successful, Theo. You wanted to be superior. You used my silence to build a pedestal for yourself, and you built it by stepping on my neck. You took my quiet support as weakness. You flaunted your fabricated wealth. You belittled me to your friends, and you paraded your mistress around town, all while secretly stealing from a company I bought to save you from ruin." Madeline turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I ask for nothing from this court. I concede the 2018 Honda Accord to Mr. Prescott, as I believe he will need reliable transportation to his new job, wherever that may be. I will keep my personal assets, as outlined in the prenuptial agreement he so viciously demanded, and I ask that this marriage be dissolved immediately." Judge Davies looked at Madeline with a mixture of awe and deep respect. He raised his gavel. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have never witnessed a more thorough or deserved dismantling of a petitioner's case," Judge Davies declared, his voice booming. "The prenuptial agreement is upheld in its entirety. All debts accrued during the marriage are hereby assigned solely to Mr. Prescott, due to his admitted and proven violations of the infidelity clause. The corporate structures remain as contracted. This divorce is granted." The gavel slammed down with a resounding, final crack. The sound echoed in Theo's ears, a harsh, unforgiving drumbeat, signaling the absolute end of his empire. He sat frozen in the witness box, a man who had tried to play God in a puddle, only to realize he had been swimming in his wife's ocean all along. The echo of Judge Davies's gavel seemed to linger in the air long after the courtroom had emptied. Theodore Prescott sat paralyzed at the petitioner's table, a monument to his own shattered hubris. Simon Fletcher, his once ferocious attorney, was uncharacteristically silent as he aggressively shoved legal pads and files into his leather briefcase. Fletcher didn't offer a word of consolation. He simply snapped the brass latches shut, shot Theo a look of profound irritation, and walked out. Fletcher knew he would likely never see the final billable hours for this disaster. Theo finally forced his legs to move. He stumbled out of the mahogany double doors and into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courthouse hallway. His mother, Beatrice, was pacing near the elevators, her face pale, and her expensive silk scarf clutched anxiously in her fist. "Theodore," she hissed, grabbing his arm as he approached. "Tell me this is a joke. Tell me you have a contingency fund. My Platinum American Express was just declined for a simple cup of coffee at the kiosk downstairs. They said the account was frozen." Theo stared at her, the reality of the situation finally piercing through his shock. The joint accounts. Madeline had frozen them the moment the gavel fell, a right secured by the very infidelity clause he had insisted upon. The $60,000 engagement ring from Cartier, the first-class flights to St. Barths with Chloe, the lavish dinners at Le Bernardin. All of it had been charged to the joint high-yield credit accounts. He was now solely liable for over $400,000 in unsecured consumer debt, and he possessed absolutely zero liquid assets to service it. I have to make a call," Theo muttered, pulling his smartphone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He dialed the direct line to his private wealth manager at J.P. Morgan Chase. The line rang twice before a polite, automated voice informed him that his access had been suspended pending a legal asset transfer, directing him to a generic customer service queue. He hung up, the blood draining completely from his face. "We need to go to the penthouse," he told his mother, his voice cracking. "My clothes, my watches, the Rolex collection. I can liquidate the watches. They're worth at least $200,000. They rushed out of the courthouse, bypassing the waiting black town car that Theo had arrogantly assumed would take him to a victory lunch. The driver had already received a cancellation notice from Zenith Consulting. Instead, Theo and Beatrice were forced to hail a yellow cab, sitting in stunned silence as it fought through the gridlocked midtown Manhattan traffic. When they arrived at 432 Park Avenue, the sleek, minimalist lobby felt as intimidating as a fortress. Theo marched past the reception desk, heading straight for the private elevator banks. "Mr. Prescott, a moment, please," a voice called out. It was Henderson, the head concierge. Henderson was a man who had silently endured Theo's condescending demands for 2 years. Today there was a noticeable lack of deference in his posture. "Not now, Henderson. I'm in a hurry," Theo snapped, swiping his key fob against the elevator's security panel. The light blinked an angry, solid red. He swiped it again. Red. "The fob has been deactivated, sir," Henderson said, stepping smoothly between Theo and the elevator doors. "I received a call from the Property Management Division of the Whitmore Endowment 30 minutes ago. You are no longer authorized to access the premises." "I live here," Theo shouted, his voice echoing off the Italian marble walls, drawing the stares of 2 wealthy residents in the lobby. "My belongings are up there." "The Whitmore Endowment anticipated this," Henderson replied, his tone perfectly polite and utterly unyielding. He gestured to a stack of 4 large, heavy-duty cardboard boxes sitting near the service entrance. A bonded packing crew was dispatched this morning. They were instructed to carefully box all items purchased exclusively with your personal funds prior to the marriage, your clothing, your personal toiletries, and your college diploma. "My watches," Theo demanded, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "There's a customized safe in the master closet. Where are my watches?" According to the inventory manifest provided by Zenith Consulting, the Rolex and Patek Philippe timepieces were purchased using funds from the Prescott Development's operational account, Henderson stated, reading from a tablet. As those funds were corporate property belonging to Obsidian Vanguard, the assets have been seized to offset corporate embezzlement. The police will be called if you attempt to trespass, Mr. Prescott. Good afternoon. Theo stumbled backward, the polished marble floor suddenly feeling like a sheet of ice. He was completely, irrevocably locked out of his own life. Beatrice let out a muffled sob, leaning against the lobby wall for support. The following Monday delivered the final, fatal blow. Theo, desperately clinging to the delusion that he could somehow salvage his position as CEO of his company, walked into the glass-walled offices of Prescott Developments in the financial district. His name was still on the wall in brushed steel letters. He didn't make it past the reception desk. 2 burly security contractors were waiting for him, flanked by David Croft, a senior executive from Obsidian Vanguard, whom Theo had always assumed was a subordinate. "Theodore," David said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "we are executing the morality and gross misconduct clauses of your employment contract. The court record from Friday regarding your unauthorized withdrawal of $1.5 million for personal real estate constitutes criminal embezzlement. Vanguard Urban, the new name of this firm, effective today, is terminating your employment immediately. We are seizing your remaining 10% equity to partially cover the stolen funds, and we reserve the right to press criminal charges should you ever violate the non-disclosure agreement regarding this company." David handed a stunned Theo a thin manila envelope. Inside is the title and keys to a 2018 Honda Accord, legally transferred to your name per the divorce decree. It is parked in the basement loading dock. You have 5 minutes to leave the building." In the span of 72 hours, Theodore Prescott had gone from a self-proclaimed titan of Manhattan real estate to an unemployed, homeless man drowning in $500,000 of credit card debt, whose only asset was a 6-year-old sedan. 6 months later, the biting chill of late October swept through the Hudson Valley, turning the dense foliage into a brilliant, fiery tapestry of crimson and gold. The Garrison family estate, a sprawling limestone manor built in the 1920s by Silas Garrison, sat quietly amidst 400 acres of private woodlands. It was a place where old money whispered rather than shouted, defined by generations of quiet accumulation rather than flashy, momentary triumphs. Madeline Hayes sat on the expansive rear terrace, a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea resting on the weathered wrought-iron table beside her. She was wrapped in a thick, cream-coloured Loro Piana cashmere sweater and faded denim, a profound visual departure from the rigid, tailored armour she had worn during the trial. She was not poring over complex financial spreadsheets, nor was she plotting further vengeance against the man who had tried to ruin her. She was simply reading a hardcover biography, listening to the rhythmic, soothing rustle of the ancient oak trees shedding their leaves. The brutal, suffocating war was finally over, and the resulting silence was exquisite. The heavy, soundproofed glass door sliding open broke the absolute tranquility of the morning. Benjamin Caldwell, her attorney, and the long-time chief legal strategist for the Garrison Family Trust, stepped out onto the terrace. He carried a battered leather portfolio, though his demeanour was entirely relaxed, lacking the sharp, predatory edge he possessed in a courtroom. "Good morning, Madeline," Benjamin smiled, pulling out a chair and taking the seat opposite her. "The air up here in Dutchess County is infinitely better than the smog choking Wall Street this morning." "It usually is, Ben," Madeline replied, carefully marking her page and setting the book down. "To what do I owe the pleasure of a house call? I thought the quarterly reviews for Zenith Consulting and the broader trust weren't scheduled until the second week of November." "They aren't," Benjamin said, opening the portfolio and extracting a remarkably thin stack of papers. "But there were a few final administrative loose ends regarding the dissolution of Vanguard Urban's legacy debts, specifically the restructuring of the commercial loans tied to the properties in Brooklyn. I thought you might appreciate a personal update, given the rather dramatic nature of the acquisition." Madeline took a slow sip of her tea, her expression remaining beautifully neutral. "Vanguard Urban is thriving under David Croft's leadership. Once we eliminated the bloated marketing budget and severed the absurd expense accounts Theodore had established to maintain his image, the profit margins stabilized almost immediately. How is the new high-rise project in Greenpoint proceeding?" "Ahead of schedule, remarkably," Benjamin nodded, tapping a financial summary sheet. "Croft partnered with Cushman and Wakefield for the commercial leasing, and they've already secured 2 anchor tenants for the ground-level retail space. Furthermore, we finally managed to liquidate the completely unnecessary luxury assets Mr. Prescott had acquired under the corporate umbrella. We dissolved the NetJet's fractional ownership and sold the fractional yacht membership in Miami. The recovered capital was immediately injected back into the construction budget." "A brilliant salvage operation," Madeline noted softly. "It is amazing how quickly a company can turn a profit when the CEO isn't actively looting the operational reserves to fund a fantasy." "Indeed," Benjamin agreed, but a faint, distinct trace of amusement began to dance in his eyes. He pulled out a single, heavily stamped sheet of paper from the back of his folder. "However, the commercial real estate market wasn't the only reason I drove up here today. I received a final notification this morning from Midland Credit Management, the debt collection agency handling the unsecured joint credit cards." Madeline's posture didn't shift, but her eyes locked onto the document. "And?" "The debt has been formally isolated and attached solely to Mr. Prescott's Social Security number, completely severing any remaining financial ties to Zenith Consulting. Benjamin explained, leaning back in his chair. It seems Theodore has finally recognized the gravity of his situation and secured steady employment to begin garnishment payments. Madeline looked out over the rolling, forested hills of her estate. Where did he land? After his reputation was so thoroughly and publicly torpedoed in the Manhattan commercial sector, he found it impossible to secure a position at any reputable firm, Benjamin said, his voice dropping into a clinical, factual register. He is currently working as a mid-level residential leasing agent for a high-volume, low-tier property management firm in Newark, New Jersey. From what my investigators gathered, he specializes in renting out garden-level studio apartments and walk-ups. Madeleine absorbed the information in silence. She felt no sudden spike of malicious joy, no overwhelming sense of vindictive triumph. She only felt a profound, settling peace. Theodore had always measured a person's worth entirely by the height of their pedestal, the exclusivity of their zip code, and the bespoke tailoring of their suit. He was now living exactly the life he had so deeply feared, interacting daily with the very working-class people he had ruthlessly mocked. "Does he still drive the Honda Accord?" she asked quietly, recalling the final asset she had allowed him to keep. "He does," Benjamin confirmed. "The transmission is reportedly slipping, but it gets him across the bridge. And, if you were curious regarding the collateral damage, Miss Sinclair officially ended her engagement to him approximately 48 hours after the trial concluded. She relocated to Miami, attempting to re-enter the luxury influencer space. However, the public nature of the court transcripts heavily damaged her brand. She was recently denied membership at the local Soho house and is currently struggling to find new sponsorship." Madeline closed her eyes, letting the crisp autumn sun warm her face. The universe, it seemed, had a remarkable way of balancing its own scales when given the proper push. "Let it go, Ben," Madeline said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the absolute weight of a finalized verdict. "Close the files on Theodore Prescott, box them up and put them in the deep storage archives. He is no longer a factor in the Garrison Trust, nor will he ever be a factor in my life again. He wanted to live in a world where only the ruthless survive, where power is the only currency that matters. He simply forgot to check who actually owned the jungle before he started roaring." Benjamin closed the leather portfolio with a soft, definitive snap. "As you wish, Madeline. The past is officially buried. The accounts are closed." Madeline opened her eyes and looked at the sprawling, multi-billion-dollar empire that stretched out invisibly before her. An empire she governed not with loud boasts, aggressive posturing, or flashy displays of wealth, but with cold competence, brilliant strategy, and absolute, unshakable control. She picked up her book, found her page, and slipped back into the quiet, luxurious comfort of being exactly who she was. The apex predator had returned to her sanctuary, leaving the scavengers to fight over the bitter scraps of a fabricated fallen kingdom. The courtroom saga of Madeline Hayes and Theodore Prescott serves as a stark reminder that true power rarely feels the need to announce itself. Arrogance, driven by insecurity, relies on the loud clatter of designer labels, leased penthouses, and public boasts to create an illusion of invincibility. Theodore built a house of cards on a foundation of unearned ego, mistaking his ex-wife's quiet support for weakness and her financial discretion for poverty. In the end, his brutal downfall was not merely an act of vengeance, but a masterpiece of calculated inevitability. Madeline did not have to destroy him. She simply removed the invisible safety nets she had placed beneath him, allowing his own greed and narcissism to pull him into the abyss. The story concludes with a timeless truth. The loudest voice in the room is often the most fragile, and the quietest observer is frequently the one holding all the cards.